Next, we're going to be seeing the witness that comes from Cochin, India, where St. Thomas took the Hebrew Gospels to India. So you need to grab your personal study journal so you can keep up with us, follow what we're doing, and be able to talk about it with everybody you know. Welcome back to the main event. This is the trail of the Hebrew Gospels. There were surviving Hebrew Gospels in Spain. We know that. We've been told that by historians and scholars that have written about it. Two things came out of it. It was translated into Catalan for those in the area of Catalonia, for those Hebrews that no longer could speak their own sacred tongue. It was also used by Shymtov Ibn Shaprut, who recopied it into Hebrew to give polemic arguments. They were forcing Jews to debate their beliefs, and if they lost the debate, they would force them and their entire community to convert. So these forced conversions were a major abuse of power at the time, and Shymtov was one of the few who won his debate, and he did so by studying the Hebrew Gospels and by writing a copy of them, and he did include polemic arguments of how to counter what they might present you with in the debate. Well, about a century later, when this massive resurgence of the Messianic Church was occurring, they took the Catalan Gospels that had been translated from the Hebrew Gospels, and then they retranslated it back into Hebrew, and that's the document that we have today. So it's a very important question whether this is not authenticity of this, whether it comes from the first century or not. And we talked about this last episode. We are going to go over it again for those who have just joined us, and to review briefly for those who watched the last episode. Because we now have new manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels, and we need to authenticate them as well. Some may be translations from the Greek, some may come from original Hebrew texts. All of them must be authenticated. How would we know? Well, we discussed the criteria. A credible ancient source that says something was different in the Hebrew Gospels from the Greek text. An event, or simply a passage that was different. Multiple citations from ancient sources. Independent historical confirmation of that, and of course, we have to have a confirmation of that in the Hebrew Gospels themselves. St. Jerome translated the Hebrew Gospels, and he talked about the early church tradition that it was the temple lintel that had been broken, not the veil that had been torn. Of course, the veil hangs beneath the lintel, so it would have been torn if the huge lintel rock over the entryway had been split in two. But to the Messianic Church, the destruction of the temple, the foreshadowing of the complete destruction of the temple, which was to happen in 40 years, was far, far more important than the symbolism of the splitting of the veil. So they do not contradict. This is mentioned in the Gospels in three places: in Matthew 27:51, in Mark 15:38, and in Luke 23:45. Now, we talked about these, whereas in your version of the Bible, the King James Version, if you have that, it speaks of the veil of the temple was rent in two. In the Hebrew Gospels, it says, these Hebrew Gospels in Matthew 27:51, the temple itself was broken on both sides, from the top to the bottom, from the back to the front, and the earth quaked, and the stones split in the middle. In Mark 15:38, the veil of the temple was rent in two. This is the King James Version. But in the Hebrew Gospels, it says the temple was broken on both sides, up and down. Now in Luke 23:45, it says the sun was darkened and the veil of the temple was rent in the middle. And in the Hebrew Gospels, it says, and the sun went dark and covered the temple, and the temple itself was split in the middle. So the breaking of the lintel, as confirmed by Jerome from the early church tradition, is reflected perfectly in the Hebrew Gospels as being different from in the Greek Gospels. So it definitely springs from an early Christian first century source. Now we're going to flash forward to 2020 because I told you recently within the past few weeks I did a blitz through Europe, ending up in the Vatican Library and starting at Cambridge University, where I discovered 5 new manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels. And I'm going to show them to you right now, and we're going to see if we can authenticate those the way we authenticated the Hebrew Gospels from Catalonia in Spain. Well, these are the manuscripts. One, what I call the Cochin Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The 4 Gospels, just like we have from the Hebrew Gospels of Catalonia, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all in Hebrew. We have another manuscript that is the entire New Testament in Hebrew, except for the book of Revelation. The entire New Testament, the Gospels, and the epistles, only Revelation is missing. The third manuscript we have is that missing document, the book of Revelation in Hebrew. We also have another manuscript, which is the Gospel of John in Hebrew, and then we have a manuscript of the epistles written in Hebrew. Acts of the Apostles, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, all in Hebrew. 5 new documents. Here's the first one, the Cochin Hebrew Gospels. There it is. HaSefer HaEvangel. So these are the books of the evangelists. Besorot, the good news of Matthew, the good news of Mark, the good news of Luke, and the good news of John. Now here's the provenance of them. The translator's note is written that they were recopied in 1810 from ancient manuscripts written in the Old Jerusalem characters. These were discovered at the synagogue of the Black Jews of Cochin. Now you want to remember that for a second. We'll get to the journey of these, talking about them. So these were translated in 1810 from the ancient Jerusalem characters, from ancient documents. Remember, it's not the date of the copy that counts, it is the date of the original document. Here's the first page of the Hebrew New Testament. The first page of, this is the book of Acts, the first page of the epistles in the Hebrew New Testament. The manuscript of the Gospel of John, and the manuscript of Revelation in Hebrew. Now I've just gotten these, but I have had enough time to do an initial analysis, which we're going to talk about. Here's the story of the Cochin Gospels. You may know that it was Thomas who went to India and he took the Hebrew Gospels with him. That's where he did his ministry work. His church still survives in Kerala province. This is where Cochin is located. And according to a church historian Eusebius, the gospel according to Matthew had been taken to India by the apostle Bartholomew, and also probably by Thomas himself. So it was written in Hebrew script, and it was preserved there until the visit of Pantaeus. And Pantaeus brought a copy of the Hebrew Matthew back with him to Alexandria in Egypt, where it was available to Origen, who in the next century did what is called the hexaplot, which is 6 different translations of the Gospels in Greek and in Hebrew for comparison. It was a major work, one that only fragments of exist now, but he had the Hebrew Gospels available with him to do that analysis. Now we're going to go back and talk about the authentication of these new Gospels from Cochin. Let's look at Matthew 27:51 in the Cochin Gospels. It says, "And suddenly the face of the entry of the temple was split in two from the beginning until the end, and the earth shook, and the heavens were hidden." And in the Hebrew Gospels from Catalonia, "And here the temple was broken on both sides, up and down, and the earth quaked, and the stones split in the middle." Again, talking of the stones of the temple itself being split, not the veil being rent asunder. Here's the translation of the Cochin Gospels. In Mark 15:38, And the entry to the temple cracked after the start of the quake. And in the Hebrew Gospels from Catalonia, the temple was broken on both sides, up and down. Again, we're talking about the stones of the temple themselves being split into, not the veil. And in Luke 23:45 in the Cochin Gospels, it was dark and split the entry of the temple down the middle. And in the Hebrew Gospel of Catalonia, and the sun went dark and covered the temple, and it was split in the middle. Two sets of Hebrew Gospels, two sets, separated by 2,000 years, 5,000 miles, and they both match the testimony of St. Jerome that in the early church tradition, it was the stones of the temple that were split in the Hebrew Gospels rather than discussion of the veil. Again, does not contradict. If the lintel was split, the veil also would have been torn in two. It's just a different perspective, a Hebrew perspective rather than a Greek perspective. But it does put a lock on the authenticity of the Hebrew Gospels. What difference does it make whether the Hebrew book of Revelation was written in Hebrew or Greek? Well, we have the Greek copies, but it was originally written in Hebrew. And if you want to understand the Hebrew perspective as put forth in the words of Yehovah and his son Yeshua, you need to read it from the Hebrew book of Revelation. I am the Aleph Tav. Revelation 1:8, the first and the last, says Yehovah Elohim, who is, who was, who will be, the Almighty. The words of the Lord himself and his son, who narrates the book of Revelation. We now know what their real names are, for example. They are Yehovah with the correct vowel pointing and Yeshua HaMashiach. All that documentation is in this book. Get yours now, the Hebrew book of Revelation at writingofgod.com. Are you trying to find the original experience of the first century church that revolutionized the world, the Jesus Revolution? Well, the best way to do that is to study the original word of the Messiah that they used, the Hebrew Gospels, which has recently been recovered, several manuscripts, and we have it for you to study on video, in workbook, in a book form, so that you can master the basics of the Hebrew Gospels, how they're different, what that tells us about our Hebrew Messiah. Everything we know about our Hebrew Messiah comes to us through a Greek filter, a different language, culture, and thought. Our Messiah was Hebrew, and these are the original words of our Savior in the Jesus movement of the first century. And this is something you can discover for yourself and see it in detail. All of these manuscripts translated and their intricacies and their differences explained to you in order to build a faith based on the original words of the Messiah. Go to writingofgod.com to get your copy. Again, this is appropriate for high school students or adults. It comes with the book, The Sons of Zion, on the history of the Messianic Church, the early church, and the study of the manuscript, all on video and in book form and workbooks.
That's online at thewritingofgod.com. That's online at thewritingofgod.com.
The Unveiled, rediscovering the Zadokite covenant of the first 3,000, reveals to us a major archaeological breakthrough covering missing pages, missing centuries of history regarding the Zadok priesthood. Now it comes in both the book and a 9-part video series. Buy the boat, save money, get started on this incredible journey. Do it today.
Will you seek the Lord about becoming a partner to bring the message of the Writing of God to more people? Send your gift to The Writing of God, P.O. Box 294047, Kerrville, Texas 78029, or online at thewritingofgod.com. That's The Writing of God, P.O. Box 294047, Kerrville, Texas 78029, or online at thewritingofgod.com.
Bye.